first Thomas Bender, Tom Bender, who is University Professor of the Humanities and Professor of History at New York University. He's probably known to all of you by his newest book, A Nation Among Nations, but he is certainly known to the historians for his report on graduate studies that is basically reshaping the way we teach history on a graduate level. I think we is all of us academics here in the United States. Mauricio Tenorio is a professor here at the University of Chicago. He was previously a professor at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas in Mexico City and is still member of that institution. His field of specialization is Latin American and cultural history of Latin American history and cultural history of Mexico. His newest book, 2006, is on Il Porfiriato. Previously, 2005, very productive historian, I should say. El Urbanista, the urban planner. And before that, a whole series of books, essentially yearly productions, truly amazing. I'm totally envious. Our third discussant in this case is Simone Laessig, who in this case I should mention the date of her PhD, because it is a dramatic year in German history. The date of her PhD is 1990, and it is from University of Dresden, and therein lies an entire history. She subsequently had Habilitationsfellowships by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, worked as research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., and this is probably the most important part for us today, she has become, I think last year, right?
Yes, in October.
Has become the director of the, probably one of the single most important textbook institutes, research institutes in the world, certainly one of the most prominent institutions in Germany that has profoundly over the decades shaped the way we do history on a high school level and then filtering into the university level in history. This institute has been very central in all the post-war negotiations on a European level, German-Polish, German-French, then more recently German-Czech, etc., etc. So this is a very, very important and central and very honored function, actually, in the German academic environment, in a world in which textbooks are not necessarily the kind of highest praised things. And this is, she herself, of course, is a historian of 19th century, with a particular focus on Jewish history, history of religions and religious cultures. And she is in the process of remodeling her institute and remodeling the journal of that institute, because of course we are no longer in the post-war. I mean, partly she starts, but partly it is also that we are no longer in the post-war and the Cold War, and she is in the process of rebuilding that institute. In that context, she is remodeling the journal of that institute. And this is where I think your proposition for this panel, for this group, comes in. And why don't you start with a few comments on that issue, and then we proceed with our papers.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to tell you that we plan a new journal. We already have a journal of the Institute, which is international textbook research edited by the Georg-Eckert-Institut in Braunschweig. And by the way, I'm not the only one remodeling the institute. I have one colleague of mine here, also in Chicago, Hanna Schissler. She's much longer part of the institute, and she's much more experienced than I am. Nevertheless, we have a very important project to remodel the institute and bring it really to high standards of international research. And one project in this process is indeed the new journal we plan. The working title is Eckert, the International Journal for Comparative Research on Education in Media and Historical Cultures. So I hope you see the point and you see the connection to this conference. I'm very glad to be invited, and I would just like to invite you, that means especially the speakers and the commentators of this day, to submit your papers you present here for this very new journal. And I would think it's a good thing to start with such profound papers. We have here at this day a new international journal that should attract the international scholarly public, and it will be printed in English and some of the essays also in German, but mainly in English. We will have abstracts in different other languages. It should be a double-blind, peer-reviewed journal. At first, it should be published biannually, maybe later 3 times a year. And it will be published with Barkan Books, Oxford, New York. So for the moment, I know we are short in time, so you are really invited, and I would be delighted to get papers that are presented here for this new journal, and so I would be delighted to be contacted by the presenters in regard of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to more or less read this in the interest of time, otherwise I will go on too much. The story that I, in fact, have come here to tell begins in Chicago in 1927, which, as many of you probably know, was a good year for home runs and for solo flights across the Atlantic, but not very good for history or biology. The initial guide for this visit to Chicago in 1927 is the most highly respected journalist of that era, Walter Lippmann. In a book entitled The American Inquisitors, published in 1928, Lippmann gave an account of 2 challenges to scholarship and the schools, one in Chicago and one in Dayton, Tennessee. In Dayton, a law against teaching evolution was at issue, while in Chicago, Mayor William Big Bill Thompson triggered the first history wars. What linked the 2 events, according to Lippmann, was that science and scholarship were brought before the bar of popular faith, or, as he put it, these 2 attacks were made by churchmen and by patriots in the name of God and country. The issue of the Scopes trial in Tennessee is pretty well known. The fundamentalists challenged the teaching of evolution in a Tennessee high school. The Chicago controversy is less well known, but its substance is hardly surprising. Thompson challenged the new history, identified with James Harvey Robinson and Charles A. Beard, particularly Beard's famous or infamous analysis of the economic interests the Founding Fathers had in the Constitution they drafted. In fact, Thompson had a staffer publicly burn a book by one of Beard's students, Arthur M. Schlesinger. That is the father of the Schlesinger who just died. The book was the new Viewpoints in American History, which he published in 1922. But Schlesinger was a minor target. The main target was another Beardian, David Muzzy, one of the most successful school textbook writers of the first half of the 20th century. According to Thompson, in Muzzy's textbook, there was not enough coverage of Irish, Polish, and German Americans. The attack was founded then on two issues. First, the new socioeconomic analysis seemed to diminish the stature of the American founders, who had been increasingly sacralized in the late 19th and early 20th century. The other had to do with representation. And I quote Thompson, "All nationalities are entitled to a place in the sun, and our national heroes are the stars in the firmament of our patriotism." His interest was in Irish, Germans, and Poles. The absence of African Americans in Histories by Beard and the Beardians, a group already substantially represented in Chicago but not among Thompson's constituency, seemed not to be a problem. Interestingly, ethnic leaders joined Americanizers in protecting the greats from criticism or diminution of any kind. I'm not going to go much into the question of evolution, but I want to say something about it because I think there are some real important relationships between the attack on evolution and the attack on history then and for that matter now. The two seem to often come together. Lippmann, I think, was on to something by having them linked. He linked the two cases by calling them both, and I quote him, episodes of a wide conflict between scholarship and popular faith, between freedom of thought and popular rule, which irritates American politics with deep discords. Lippmann, who a few years before, in a book called Public Opinion, had laid down what John Dewey, the philosopher, called perhaps the most effective indictment of democracy as currently conceived ever penned. And he thus was ready to dismiss the popular voice side of this equation. For those of us with a stronger commitment to democracy, this situation produces more angst. What are the claims of trained intellect in a democracy? Who is empowered or authorized in a democracy to define not only public knowledge, but in the case of textbooks, required public knowledge? Speaking for democracy and directly challenging Lippmann, John Dewey, in his book The Public and Its Problem, 1927, sought to reduce the claims of experts in favor of a democratic public in which trained intellect participated and brought its special strength to the discussion. He imagined the public something in the fashion of a community of scientific inquirers. That may be a bit far from Chicago politics. But there is something in this little phrasing of his that helps clarify, I think. The difference between the historians and biologists and the public in these controversies is actually the place of inquiry. Fundamentalism characterizes both the churchmen and the patriots. Knowledge for them is fixed and eternal, while for scientists and historians it is the object of continual inquiry and revision. Darwin's big challenge, as Dewey pointed out in 1909 on the 50th anniversary of Origin of Species, was to make change, not permanence, the way of the universe and truth. That is what fundamentalists were resisting, and I suspect that remains the case. More can be said about the similarity between the evolution debate and the history one. Both were engaged with fundamental questions of identity, one national identity, the other biological or human identity. Both the newer history and evolutionary theory introduced complex theories based upon necessarily incomplete evidence, often understood as relativism in an era when simple facts were preferred and understood. In yet another way, the two are linked. The human narrative, whether of biological life or social life, is favored so long as it is an imminent unfolding of an ideal. God's intentions for Adam and Eve and the human family in one case, and in the other, the progressive realization of the ideals of the founding fathers. And finally, both revealed a breach between the working scientist or historian and the general public. What is a technique of practice for the scientist or historian is often understood by the layperson as philosophy. Thompson's fuss is the precursor of today's history wars. Two of the three central themes today are addressed by him. The first is the insistence that history be committed to a positive nationalism or patriotism. There is no such thing as constructive criticism, however empirically based. The second has to do with battles over inclusion or representation or presentation, however one wants to put it. The third theme, which I want to turn to now, concerns America's connection or lack of it with the rest of the world. This issue also has a Chicago connection, but its context is World War II. In the midst of the war, the New York Times published a survey of 7,000 college students in 36 institutions of higher learning. The results, as always seems to be the case with such surveys, was panic-producing. The Times made it a cause, and one of its leading reporters, Benjamin Fine, won a Pulitzer Prize for his series, actually written from a point of view, admittedly, but actually quite well-informed and fair, on the state of American history in the schools. Columbia's Alan Nevins was also a major advocate, often in the pages of the Times. Without knowledge of American history, he asked, would our soldiers know what they were fighting for? He also insisted that the nation was the proper unit of historical narrative. Particularly in wartime, he explained, national identity must be emphasized, and he insisted that such self-understanding was the product, and the only way to do this was through the historical study of national development. Historians agreed with Nevins on the importance of American history and the need for better teaching of American history. But many were concerned by the constraint of a parochial and isolationist historiography. It was a moment when many historians were no less one-worlders than Wendell Willkie, who would be presidential candidate in 1944, whose book One World was published in 1943, or than Henry Luce, who more famously, perhaps, or better remembered, his famous American Century article in Life magazine insisted, "Our world is one world, fundamentally indivisible." Anti-isolationists, and remember, the 30s were a period of isolationism when Roosevelt was trying to get us out of isolationism and engage the coming troubles in the Far East and in Europe. Anti-isolationist historians were pressing for world history courses and a U.S. history course that located American history in its global context, or world context, they would have said. Two efforts along this line were made to establish an American history guidelines for the schools. The first was initiated, and I just discovered this thing. I never knew such a thing existed. The Division of Higher Education in the Federal Security Administration. I'd like to know more about the Federal Security Administration myself. At any event, they contacted the American Historical Association about the possibility of devising a report on the adjustment of the college curriculum to wartime conditions and needs. The American Historical Association established a committee chaired by Professor Bessie Pierce of the University of Chicago, and the project was staffed entirely by members of the Chicago department. They thought that world history was a pertinent curricular response to the circumstances of the World War and the growing power and responsibility of the United States. For that reason, they developed a world history syllabus, but they also developed a syllabus for a more worldly U.S. history course. In their report, they argued that, and I quote, "The college survey course in United States history, even when it is ably taught, does not give enough attention to the hemispheric and world setting of our history. American history, according to Pierce's group, and I quote again, must be wider in scope than United States history alone." This proposal was clearly driven by an anti-isolationist politics, a point especially pressed by Walter Johnson, then a newly recruited assistant professor. Putting the point negatively, they wrote that the survey course and curriculum generally, quote, should serve as an antidote to our traditional isolationism and provincialism. Stated more positively, they proposed, and I quote again, that it provide a worldwide frame of reference for our domestic as well as our foreign problems. There are other syllabi and even courses taught at some other universities, including the University of North Carolina and Barnard College at Columbia. And at the latter, Eugene Byrne mounted a course entitled De-Isolationized U.S. History, World History from the American Standpoint, 1500 to 1942. There were experiments elsewhere, but the Pierce proposal was the most ambitious, and it was circulated to all colleges and universities by the Federal Security Administration. But as we shall see in a moment, it was displaced in public discussion by a more nationalist movement for American history, pure, simple, essentialized, and a lot of it. The other large project that was prompted by the Times survey was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and it involved the American Historical Association, the Mississippi Valley Historical Association, which was an earlier name of what is now the Organization of American Historians, and the National Council on Social Studies. Challenging the claim of Nevins, the Times, and many patriotic groups that claimed not enough history was taught, they argued that plenty was taught, but it was taught very poorly. The committee, chaired by Edgar B. Wesley of the University of Minnesota, was called the Special Committee on Teaching of American History, proposed what might be called a critical understanding of history. They rejected memorization, stressing rather what we might today call analytical skills and historical thinking. The emphasis should be on important events and themes, the development of interpretive and synthesizing skills, the capacity to distinguish between fact and opinion, and skills in reading and interpreting maps, charts, and other forms of data presentation. And finally, and actually I think quite interestingly, especially when I can't get a class to discuss some readings, skills in carrying on group discussion of historical questions were thought to be an important part of the curriculum. They also argued that American history should be so written and taught so as to produce in the minds of the students, quote, a keen consciousness of the world beyond the United States. The report pointed out that the United States has never actually in real history been isolated. Students should be taught history with, again a quote, continuous awareness of the relations between the United States and the rest of the world. There was actually substantial support within the profession for such an approach to U.S. history, including slightly other versions, such as in History of the Americas, which was something that Herbert Bolton had proposed in his presidential address to the AHA in 1933, and what we now call Atlantic World as a framework. Nevins, who held a strongly exceptionalist view of American history, was sharply critical of anything that would dilute the amount of American history taught, or that it should somehow blend into a larger history. While not explicitly anti-cosmopolitan, the position of Nevins in the Times undercut the efforts to broaden American history. Their campaign fueled the panic that not enough American history was being taught, or perhaps even taught at all. The one-worlder, Wilkie, during his presidential campaign, apparently thinking that the crisis was the entire absence of American history in the curriculum, was quoted by the New York Times as saying, "It's about time that United States history should be taken up in the United States schools." 2/3 of the college presidents of the United States felt the same way, as did the National Education Association, the National Association of Manufacturers, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. And of course, the omnipresent and always quotable Nicholas Murray Butler of Columbia University weighed in on the subject of more American history for, as he felt, the national story of the United States was the model for the future of the world. The result of this debate that played on for months, not only in the Times, but in newspapers across the country, was not deprovincialization, but a deeper provincialism, marked by the flowering of American civilization programs in universities around the country, all embedded in exceptionalist thinking. Many state legislatures and local school boards mandated American history within this frame. In 1950, Edgar Wesley, who had chaired the committee that insisted that the problem was poor teaching and parochialism, not an insufficient number of courses, declared, "Legislative fiat has sentenced American boys and girls of the atomic age to close their eyes to the rest of the world." It was not that the Pierce and Wesley proposals were challenged directly, but they were simply swamped by a number of influential elites and a nervous public concerned about bolstering national identity and nationalism, and more than ever committed to notions of American exceptionalism. In the circumstance, a cosmopolitan American history seemed irrelevant at best and downright dangerous at worst. I'm going to skip now to more recent times, and Prasenjit already brought this up. That is the controversy over national history standards in the mid-1990s. That's, I suppose, familiar at least to Americanists and people involved specifically with world history. But I want to talk about it here because it brings together the same points of conflict that were present in the first two examples. And basically what I'm going to show, I hope, when I'm through, that there's a consistency of hotspots dealing with the teaching of history. Again, there is a spirit of fundamentalism. History is fixed and built of clear, uncontested facts, not inquiry or interpretation. And again, as in the Chicago case in 1927, there was a contest over representation. The question of the relation of the United States to Western civilization, world, or global history was again debated. In fact, this issue may have produced the most intense conflict, one that played out interestingly in the battle over world history standards rather than the American ones. And there was a sharp break, seemingly unbridgeable, between professional knowledge and public understanding of the substance of history. One might also argue that it revealed a generational gap in the way history was taught, and that's something that wasn't present in the earlier 1920s and 1940s conflicts. 1989 was a remarkable year, and many of the events associated with it are pertinent context for the controversy over national history standards. If 1989 is often taken as a marker for contemporary globalization, it also witnessed the resurgence of nationalism and a figure of the world as a field of international competition. The end of the Cold War also stimulated historical inquiry. Historians in the countries of Eastern Europe rushed to recover, write, and rewrite their histories. Revisionism was afoot in France as the meaning of the French Revolution was transformed, and German historians battled over World War II and, by implication, German history more broadly. The British government worried about the history curriculum in its schools and undertook a history curriculum project. There was worry in the United States about cultural literacy and historical literacy. A study entitled, "What Do Our 17-Year-Olds Know?" concluded that the answer was not much. A report on the humanities had the provocative title, "A Nation at Risk." On the right, Alan Bloom published his best-selling critique of relativism, The Closing of the American Mind, in 1987, another Chicago connection. And he was joined by other conservatives expressing their worries about postmodernism, post-structuralism, and multiculturalism. The competition promised by globalization prompted talk about more rigor in education, standards, and testing. In 1989, President George Bush addressed the nation's governors, arguing for the establishment of clear performance goals for our schools, goals that will make us internationally competitive. Subsequently, under the leadership of Governor Bill Clinton, the National Governors Association took up the challenge. Among many goals the governors established, one is pertinent to history and the controversy over history. Quote, "All students will be knowledgeable about the diverse cultural heritage of this nation and about the world community." These were distinctive U.S. concerns for history. Nothing like this appears in the contemporaneous British guidelines, and both turned out to be highly controversial, as were charges of interpretation, which for the critics meant relativism. With the exception of Sidney Hook, who I think wrote the most powerful critique of this aspect of Bloom's book. The right lined up with Bloom on the matter of relativism. In fact, using different language, some version of what the right called relativism was precisely what the historians had in mind when they talked about their goal of developing historical thinking, or sometimes just critical thinking, which among other things encouraged the recognition of the limits of objectivity, which among other things encouraged the recognition of the limits of objectivity and the necessarily interpretive character of history that in turn requires a capacity for discrimination in the appraisal of evidence. In December of 1991, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Department of Education jointly announced a grant to the Center for History in the Schools, located at UCLA, and co-directed by Charlotte Crabtree, a specialist in social studies education, and Gary Nash, a leading historian on the UCLA faculty. Together, they brought into conversation a wide variety of stakeholders. The meetings were often contentious. In particular, Chester Finn, sometimes joined by Diane Ravitch, continually complained about political correctness. Finn and others were also uneasy with world history. They feared it would dilute America's European heritage and Western civilization generally. The American Historical Association, by contrast, was adamant that neither European civilization nor the West ought to be privileged in the framing or even the naming of world history. But progress was made. They had a draft. Not long before Lynn Cheney resigned from the chairmanship of the National Endowment upon the election of Bill Clinton, she wrote to Crabtree in praise of the first draft. Quote, "What nice work you do. I've been saying lately that the best grant I've ever given is to your standard-setting project." It's not clear why Cheney decided to turn on the project she had initiated and lauded, but most attribute her shift to politics, mainly Newt Gingrich's leadership of the Republicans' 1994 election victory that gave them control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. He brought a hard-right agenda and a confrontational style. Perhaps both Cheney and the other major critic on the right, William Bennett, wanted to secure leadership roles in the resurgent Republican right. It was also a brilliant stroke on her part to open the attack on the pages of the Wall Street Journal before the report was released, thus defining the issues and the facts that would focus the debate. She fabricated her presentation of the guidelines from a clutch of minor details, mostly drawn from the 2,500 suggestions, these were mentioned earlier, 2,500 suggestions for teachers seeking to develop critical thinking rather than from the guidelines themselves, the bullets, as Prasenjit mentioned. Whatever her strategies in lighting a match to the tinderbox, the important thing is that the box was there, waiting. There was widespread distrust of academics who were pictured either as raging radicals or scam artists, as described in a flood of what are called prof scam books. And as I've already indicated, there were worries about global competition, claims that multiculturalism was going to pull the nation apart, and a fear of relativism. It was high tide in the so-called culture wars that to a significant extent tracked the battle lines of the history wars. There was also a particular kind of patriotism at issue. Diane Ravitch, a critic but more intelligent and fair-minded than Cheney or most of the others, captured this. Instead of a history of the successful, eminent unfolding of democratic rights and economic opportunities over time, she noted that the standards presented even assumed a struggle by the excluded, a struggle too often unsuccessful. There was a generational division. When in January 1995, 2 months after Cheney's blast in the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. Senate voted 99-1 in favor of a non-binding resolution condemning the history standards. The only good part about that is they took history seriously.
With which they know nothing.
California Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's, I think, one of the more sophisticated members of that particular club, declared in voting among the 99 that when she was a student at Stanford University, Thomas Bailey taught her facts, not interpretations. I think she was reflecting the way history was taught more generally when she was a student, and even when I was a student. It was declarative sentences telling it just how it was. The concern for historical thinking, for critical analysis, was much greater in the standards. In his own fashion, the right-wing commentator Rush Limbaugh, who proposed that the standards be flushed down the sewer of multiculturalism, clarified the matter with a very awkward, even incoherent sentence. I quote, "Now, you got to listen closely. Now, if you want to get into why what happened, that's probably valid too. But why what happened shouldn't have much of anything to do with what happened." There was.
I've been trying to figure that out.
There was another division also related to generations, but more culpably to what Gary Nash calls the long walk of the historians. After World War II, academic historians living in what some historians now call academe's golden age disengaged from K through 12 education. The consequence was that teachers in the nation's schools, to say nothing of parents, were not being brought along as professional history underwent a scholarly revolution greater than any time since the period 1890 to World War I. The 1960s and 1970s transformed the methods, the foci, the boundaries of history, with implications not only for content, but also for modes of teaching history. Neither parents nor teachers were prepared for the gap that opened up and was exposed during these debates. Even if Cheney had not misrepresented the standards, and indeed the continuing debate was based mainly on her biased and even dishonest summary of them, there would have been a shock of misrecognition among many teachers and parents. Making women, Indians, and enslaved peoples actors in history was a shock. Looking at their experience through their eyes was novel. For Cheney and many patriots, it seemed to diminish the great figures, not only the founding fathers, but the giants of technological innovation and business as well. These individuals, for her and for most who had read history, a textbook before 1960, had made history, had made the United States. Her most fierce and repeated complaint was that George Washington was not specifically identified as the first president. Only his administration was. And that Thomas Edison was not mentioned at all, whereas Harriet Tubman was mentioned several times. The other issue that especially irked Cheney and William Bennett, former chair of the National Endowment and Secretary of Education, was the very notion of world history, which diminished European history. While much of the argument on the humanist right seems to fit the exceptionalist vision of America, in the end, they were as anxious to connect American history to European history as Daniel Rogers would be 3 years later in his important book, Atlantic Crossings. Bennett argued that America is unified by the ideals rooted in Western civilization. European political, philosophical, literary, and aesthetic ideals, he insisted, provide, and I quote him here, provide the glue that binds together our pluralistic nation. 3/4 of a century after Randolph Bourne, inspired by pragmatism, published Transnational America, an essay widely reprinted and eagerly read by Americanists in the 1980s and 1990s, which elaborated an American history continually in the process of making and remaking itself out of diverse materials, Bennett argued a STEM theory of American history which bears a clear resemblance to the Anglo-Saxonism of the historiography of the 1880s and 1890s that Bourne had explicitly challenged and the profession had long since abandoned. No multiculturalism for Bennett. America still belonged to the Northern Europeans, the core of American nationality. That is why he attacked Stanford University's restructuring of its introductory civilization requirement in a way that ended the exclusive reliance on European texts and leveled the intellectual playing field of humanistic education by placing European texts and those from around the world into conversation, thus expanding the introduction to the humanities to embrace the whole human archive. There's one final controversy I want to consider. In 22 states, most importantly California, Florida, and Texas, the State Department of Education vets K through 12 textbooks and puts them on approved lists. In some states, most notably Texas, this process is highly politicized, and the focus is most often on biology and history textbooks, and more recently, science and geography textbooks that deal with environmental issues. Because of the size of the Texas market, the adoption process is a high-stakes game full of drama. Because of this concentration on the Texas market, which is worth $700 million, the rest of the country is likely to get the textbooks Texas adopts, or books publishers hoped Texas would adopt. The process involved public participation, but the public is usually represented at the hearings by highly ideological lobbying groups. One group called Texans for America objected to illustrations of George Washington, arguing that they, quote, lacked his familiar features of kindness and dignity. Recently, in California, organized pressure by Sikhs forced the substitution of one image of Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, for another that made him look more modern. In 2002, the Conservative Texas Policy Association, one of the most active watchdogs with dozens of volunteer readers, objected to 2 paragraphs of Out of Many, A History of the American People. The problem, couldn't be a high school or a college textbook, actually. The problematic paragraphs referred to prostitution in the West. The issue was not fact. Whether or not the passage was true, the leader of the group declared, quote, I don't mean that we should sweep things under the rug, but that children should see the hope and the good things about America, end quote. The authors were willing to negotiate a number of small changes in various places, but they would not remove this passage. The publisher declined to support the scholars, fearing that a fight would harm the chances of the 27 other books they submitted for approval in Texas. They withdrew the book. They didn't want any discussion of it. These examples point to our touchy themes: representation, founders, worldly connections, and a positive view naturalizing the unfolding of American history. The issue of the illustrations is a trivial matter, and the question of prostitution is certainly not one of the most important themes in American history. But the real issue is the intimidation and self-censorship it encourages. That is not trivial or inconsequential. The issue is a process that indeed replaces scholarship with politics in deciding the content and a selection of textbooks. Small, highly focused, and energetic groups can change textbooks and do. This is democratic participation, and that fact brings us back to Lippmann's worry. It also points to something that may be even more important that Lippmann didn't bring up, or at least this last point is about the Texas textbook and prostitution. It was already an issue when Lippmann wrote, but he didn't address it. That is, the decisions of what proposed changes to accept or reject are not made on scholarly grounds, but on commercial ones. While government scrutiny or production of textbooks is quite worrisome, privatization of the school history curriculum is an equally serious problem. We have outsourced our curriculum to textbook publishers who care only for sales and bring market values to the making of textbooks. They demonstrate an impressive flexibility in responding to political and market demands. Why? Take note. The annual expenditure on textbooks in 2002 was $4.5 billion. It's probably now about $5 billion. Perhaps this brings us back to Nash's long walk, but in a different way, one emphasizing politics and professionalism, not scholarly innovation. Who stands up for the public interest in scholarship? Where are the historians? Are we part of the public influencing textbook approvals? Should we be? Except for textbook authors who are sometimes grilled at these hearings, the profession at large, whether it's the American Historical Association or local historians, is rarely in evidence. Very recently, and this was already mentioned, the AHA has perhaps awakened. It took a strong stand this year, making a statement challenging a Florida law signed by Jeb Bush in 2006 that required that American history, quote, be viewed as factual, not as constructed. Such statements are, of course, welcome, but more is needed. We need historians at those meetings explaining scholarship and defending scholarship. Scholars may have to match the presence of those who would put narrow political interest before scholarship and challenge the threat to scholarship and honest education that the lobbies represent. That's it.
Okay. Well, as it turns out, I just wrote a footnote to Professor Bender's talk, as you will see. I taught history in Spanish last winter here in Chicago at Pilsen, which is the Mexican barrio for those who. I encouraged my students then, almost all of them Mexicans, to ruminate whether the history they learned in their textbooks was useful to both understand and live their present, not as an abstract concept, but as I put it to them, as the we, all of you and I here, learning history in Spanish on Mondays nights over Chicago winter. Interestingly, there were different answers to my challenge, but there was a consensus. Do not mess around with our history. Our teachers and our textbooks, told me Jose, a very smart student educated in Guadalajara and currently employed as prison guard in Chicago. Our teachers and textbooks did a hell of a good job. I believe in the history they taught me. And do not touch it. It is all we have left here. Es lo que nos queda aquí. The answer remains an enigma to me. It says a lot about the success of a national history, which seems now to be more important, at least as a feeling, than the protection of two states. The answer also brings to mind something I somehow knew. History is a riddle that both dares us to expand our imagination, but also forces us to abandon doubts in order to maintain a history, my history, our history. In discussing textbook controversies today, I want to take the challenge of Jose's answer, returning history to enigmas. Could historians expand their possibilities of imagination? Could they reveal a past whose power will not be in nostalgia, but in the pride of belonging to a long-in-the-making and alive common history? Could textbooks tell stories full of unsolved passages and contradictions which could include the same Guadalajara, Mexican school books, Chicago professors, Illinois prisons, and the search for expanded notions of citizenship and historical consciousness? On riddles. Textbooks are natural enemies of enigmas and riddles. Controversies in Mexico, the US, or Spain have derived from textbooks' obsession with directness, simplicity, and fear of doubts and ambiguities. What can professional historians do about it? Every country faces different problems vis-à-vis the role of the historian and textbooks. Partha Chatterjee, in commenting on recent textbooks in debates in India, points out to the need for the historian to write in academic English and in other Indian languages in a non-academic fashion. In Mexico, historians do not lack a public voice. In fact, more often than not, we have abused the general great interpretation essay and failed to keep up with rigorous scholarship and research. In addition, Mexican historians had been, until recently, too close to state projects and sponsorship, particularly textbooks. As a direct consequence, we often consume all narratives, which include strong nationalistic touches. In the US, despite so much talking of the end of intellectuals and the decline of public importance of academic history, as Ian Tyrrell and Thomas Bender have shown, there is a well-institutionalized public voice for history. But there is also in the US a sort of textbook state of mind. Few countries require even college students to use textbooks in the courses. It is difficult to challenge historical narrative in undergraduate courses in which A historical problematique is not a problematique until it does not acquire a format of either a textbook or a reader. To be sure, many issues between the nationalistic historiographies of Mexico and the US could be taught as a series of unsolved enigmas, ironies, contradictions, because there is a major irony to begin with. We come with two serious and stern narratives of almost two ontologies, Mexico and the US, when in fact it is the same history, the same people. So why fear riddles in Mexico and the US is a common history? Why fear riddles if Mexico-US common history is made of them? Before reviewing Mexico's textbook with this question in mind, Mexico textbook Controversies as a test for the limits of historical imagination within the US and Mexico, allow me to briefly examine two other interconnected enigmas that can be found in various national textbook controversies. And the first one is, of course, the enigma of oblivion and memory as mechanisms of revenge, justice, and reconciliation. Mexico's history, a quasi-perfect victim narrative, is not the best example for this dilemma. In the same manner that Nietzsche's chaos, a victim's story is not obliged to know of the value of oblivion. Better examples of the riddle of oblivion and justice are, among others, Spain and Germany. The second enigma is that of inclusion, or the dilemma faced by any national narrative, primarily by the who are we, who has been left out. Mexico's textbook controversies have dealt somehow with this enigma, but post-1950s debates by and large have not been about who we are. On the contrary, recent textbook debates in Mexico have been less about who are we and more about how to remain what has already been learned about the meaning of Mexico by Mexicans and non-Mexicans alike. That is, José's nostalgia is also the way non-immigrants and Americans discuss the history of Mexico. Better example of the enigma of inclusion of the who we are, or who are we, is the history textbook controversies in the US and India. What I want to say in brief is that the enigma of what Sanjay Subramanian identified as today's grievance industry, or that of the Huntington-like who are we, are made possible within the paradigm of the nation-state and within assumed binary of authentic communities versus liberal nations, non-Western versus Western, the real ethos versus the fake ethos. A visible enigma to current historical imagination between the US and Mexico lies in experimental crossings of the limits of the paradigm. My point is, Mexican Americans have been for long the same people, the same economy, the same history, and yet the most we have been able to do, we historians, been able to do between Mexico and the US, is to tame the grievance industry, or to construct ethnic ghettos in the past, or to appeal to current creeds of diversity and multiculturalism, reinforcing the civilizational gap that divides racially, historically, and culturally lo mexicano from lo gringo. On oblivion. Textbook controversies show the enigma of history as the science or, as it were, the art of oblivion. On one hand, what reigns in textbooks is selective forgetfulness. On the other, justice is expected to naturally flow from the historical truth synthesized especially by textbooks. When the prominent Mexican poet Jaime Torres Bodet, as general director of the UNESCO, sponsored the 1949 conference establishing guidelines for world textbooks, Germany was, of course, in everybody's mind. East and West Germany dealt differently with their difficult common past. In West Germany, for long, silence and whispers bordering between nostalgia and guilt prevailed. The project of Europe as a history allowed Germany's Sonderberg to become a tamed and acceptable common German and European historical path. It also allowed, for instance, the Turkish and Greek historiographies to diminish the grievance industry. Yet in Germany, recent narratives and history books, which have openly dealt with Germans as victims, have restarted debates. We no longer have a history, wrote in 1943 Hans Henrik Nozak, witnessing the destruction of Hamburg. We no longer have a history. Perhaps we could not feel this. Perhaps we could not feel this so painfully if there were not people who still have a past from which they derive their standards for tomorrow. End of quote. Tragedy produces, it seems to be, oblivion, and thus no history. And without history, there is hardly a tomorrow, not at least as far as others come with their history. In fact, I have the impression that oblivion and history and potential futures have a more necessary relationship. 2 generations of German and Spanish teachers and historians were very aware of the import of oblivion for justice. They enacted it. With Europe in mind, a generation of German and Spanish historians directed the powers of oblivion in order to create a new paranational pride while keeping the edifice of a national historical consciousness alive. But in both countries, beginning in the 1990s, the spectrum of justice through history reemerges. As we speak, the socialist government in Spain is trying to pass La Ley de la Memoria Histórica, a law to rule historical memory in view of the oblivion and silence that resulted from both Franquismo and La Transición. Mass graves ought to be uncovered and studied. Monuments to El Generalísimo ought to be banned. The debate is boiling and includes fights over archives, textbooks, and all sorts of nationalist, ideological, and religious issues. There seems to be an immense faith in the justice-making power of history. And thus La Transición, the transition to democracy, is often seen as a fraud for having imposed oblivion. But perhaps oblivion needs not to be so mistreated. After all, oblivion was the liberating might that history, as an enlightened form of knowledge, produced. It allowed the reinvention of past and futures beyond atavist mandates, be they divine, genetic, cultural, or civilizational. It was not oblivion that produced oblivion. On the contrary, it was hard and painful memories that made the implicit pact of oblivion in Spain possible. Today, historians in Spain can safely and not too honestly fight over the facts and truth. Very likely the new true histories will also mean experimenting with new kinds of oblivion. For instance, by minimizing the errors and horrors of the Spanish Last Republic. If future textbooks in Spain could talk not of the new true, La Transición as a fraud, but of the debates themselves within the European context, Spain's children will be well served. With respect to history as justice, of course, Mexican historians, as all historians, have believed in the history as a court of justice. I'm not going to give you historical examples. Let me give you a more current example. Recent textbooks, controversies, and migration debates in Mexico have once again brought to the front row the enigma of history as a court of justice. Thus, commentators, politicians, and historians in Mexico often return to 1848, to the idea of La Reconquista, or the U.S. historical guilt, in order to talk about immigration and textbooks today. On the other side, in the US, in explaining immigration, once again, commentators and historians remind us of Mexico's chaos and incapabilities in the 1840s or in 2007. From there, it has been very easy, even for a Harvard professor, once again to warn Americans of the civilizational challenge which Mexico constitutes. This antagonistic view about history and justice permeate the entire common history of the two countries. In fact, we can use the problem of immigration and the welfare of Mexican workers in the US to face the challenge of oblivion and justice in history writing. To be sure, evocations of 1848 are not working to improve the circumstances faced by contemporary Mexican immigrants, nor is it working for distant political scenarios in which the de facto Mexico and American integration could not only be economically but also politically and culturally institutionalized in new forms of citizenship. Irony and oblivion help here. One could teach for Mexicans to consider 1848 as an argument in current immigration debate. One could teach that for Mexicans to consider 1848 as an argument in current immigration debate is both a historiographical and a political blunder. On the one side, the assumed historical Mexican right over the expropriated territories was acquired by Mexico also by derecho de conquista, by claiming to be the successor of the Kingdom of New Spain, which declared over the many native groups possession of those territories. So it's historically incorrect. On the other, justice for immigrants, I believe, will be reached despite US and Mexican histories, departing from the dilemma of two nationalist historiographies and one totally, in economic, cultural, and human terms, integrated region. In order to face this dilemma, hoping for better futures, scenarios, historians ought to depart from the fact that Mexicans are here to stay and will keep coming, and that the economic prosperity and misfortune of the US are inevitably linked to the United States, to Mexico. Thus, what history could serve to imagine different scenarios that respond to this reality? Only through some ironic use of the dilemma of oblivion and justice in history could this be achieved. This is what elsewhere I have summarized in a way that can be briefly expressed in Spanish. De historia para ser a historia para estar. That is, from history as a natural language of identities, national or otherwise, to history as the language to read, realize, plan, and unplan where we are and where we want to be in the future. On the who are we? Textbook controversies often have been about to include according to who we are. In 1965, a study of the images of Latin America in the United States, a school textbook, revealed an obsession with race and the making of Spain into everything that the US was not. Thus, Mexico was a nation of racially pure Indians. Quote, although Mexico is called a Latin American country, nearly 1 out of 3 persons is a pure-blooded Indian. 1965, and still race, and more race. The study undertook a sample of students' knowledge about Latin America. When asked about cruelty to Indians in comparative perspective, that is, Spain versus England, 81.8% of the students believed that Spaniards had been cruel. Only 6.1% thought that Spain was tolerant. And of course, more than 90% of students thought that Spaniards were greedy and conquerors. From 6 to 10% thought that England were the same, greed and conquerors. A small wonder with this education, recently even such a progressive and critical historiographical perspective as that of David Hollinger sustained that a national narrative in the US, quote, is a national solidarity committed but often failing to incorporate individuals from great variety of communities of descent, not on equal but not homogeneous terms, into a society with democratic aspirations inherently largely from England. So here we are. Here we have it. Inclusion, democracy, solidarity, and of course England. Inclusion, fine and good. But why not say, without trying to be ecumenically multiculti, but simply historically accurate, inherited from England, France, Spain, and also Africa and Mexico. By 2006, a pioneer global approach to US history, Thomas Bender and Nations Among Nations, had radically changed the inclusion perspective by historizing the civilizational line. I quote, in 1848, the Senate ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Americans wanted Mexican land. the more sparsely populated the better, not Mexican people. And the underlying racism at work here revealed itself in the continuing controversy over slavery. While the new boundary did not end all transnational personal ties or dissolve a partly shared culture, it was still a profoundly important division that marked distinct paths of future development. Even more interesting, Bender says, atlases published in the US during the 1850s introduced a new novel concept of the Americas as two continents, no one. As two continents, not one. Bender's book, end of the quote, is truly pioneer, though it is still yet to be seen whether this view will filter to general history teaching in the United States. Nevertheless, the TAR formation does illustrate how historical imagination has been expanded among some US historians. The interesting thing is that despite its obvious importance in the past and the present, it has never been Mexico, but the obsession with England and the legacy of slavery, what has produced more challenge to conventional US narratives. How many more centuries of common history? How many more Mexicans in the US? How many more economic integration will it take for the US history textbook to deal with the common history as something more than a sort of ethnic short appendix to a vast nationalistic narrative? But, in the other side is not happy either. When I was invited to rethink US history by David Thielen and Thomas Bender several years ago, I thought for sure I will find plenty of Mexican historians who will accept that invitation to enter into an explorer terrain. But I have had a surprising experience. Not much interest, and my attempts in Spanish at dealing with the common past with the United States have been considered more times than not as those of a vendepatrias, a sold out to the gringos, by some Mexican Americans and US Mexicanist colleagues. Historical imagination in Mexico also has serious boundaries. In India, blood and violence have to be kept in mind when discussing the prevalence of a secular Nehru-like modernization India, or a Hindu India, or a Persian India. The largest democracy of diverse languages, religion, and traditions has been in the business of history, as historians have shown, long before 1757. For long, Neeladri argues, the ideas of pre-colonial society the ideas of pre-colonial societal stasis, self-sufficient villages, communities, oriental despotism prevail. Through these categories, the West had constituted, Neeladri tells us, an East that was in essence the inverse of the West, a difference that could be understood only through a rhetoric of contrast that defined two opposed civilizations, one progressive, the other primitive. End of quote. Rather than immersing myself with my ignorance of Indian languages and my ranchero naivete in these debates, allow me to just point out how this Indian civilizational gap that Neeladri talks about was echoed by the mutual historical construction of the US and Mexico. All proportions kept, the full inclusion of Mexican history into US history and the other way around have been hindered by the unchallenged conviction that Mexico belongs to another civilization. Mexico became a fixed cultural niche. It is an idea fixe, caged as very few modern national images are, a not real West and a second-class East. These are the limits of current imagination that the mere idea of inclusion will never face. On the unthinkable. For more than 4 decades, Mexican textbooks had taught a national history based on nacionalismo revolucionario, especially through the massive work and support of the National Union of Teachers, which for years was the closest thing to the guardian of the historical consciousness of the nation. Nacionalismo revolucionario, no doubt, was successful if measured as popular notions of what constitute national history. And it was successful not solely because it was maintained by corporatives, by a strong teacher union and by intellectuals, by a corporate state, by a strong teacher union and by intellectuals, but also because it addressed many lasting concerns of Mexican political culture. And more importantly, because it was the ideology attached to a vast, if corrupt, project of modernization and a project of a welfare state. Among the main characteristics of this nacionalismo revolucionario, I want to highlight three. Anti-Americanism mixed with military and economic integration to the United States, especially not in NAFTA years, but since the 1910s. Second, indigenism blended with mestizophilia, with the love of miscegenation. And finally, victimism blended with the denial of any wrongdoing. Of course, this nationalism, this history, was consumed locally in different ways. And these variations and their common point of reference have been the Mexico learned by various generations of Mexicans. But one point, this nationalism was not made solely and was not solely believed by Mexicans. Very important. It is at the roots, this nationalism is at the roots of the current belief of what Mexico means in the world. Starting with the Mexican Revolution as Mexican passport to modernity, countless people from all over the world participated in the creation of this nationalism, either directly or by merely sanctioning it. Only the import and success of this nationalism as the global image of Mexico should serve as a proof of the lasting and mighty U.S. mutual cultural construction. It is a fact, nacionalismo revolucionario has for long been as American as Mexican. It was not only Rivera in the National Palace, but it was Rivera back in Mexico after decades of Parisian production in order to project himself from Mexico to Detroit and to New York. It was not only the socialist rhetoric of a Mexican state, but the total incorporation of Mexican intelligence services, industry, and tourism into the American state and the American people. Any new view of Mexico, in textbooks or otherwise, necessarily faces the advocates of pristine non-Western communities of Riveras, Fridas, and tales of fiesta, siesta, guerrillas, and sombreros. In 1922, the textbook that was the last test controversy, contrary to what many critics said in 1992 textbooks, controversy, which never were enforced as a result of the protest, were not a total negation of nationalism revolutionario, but a simple and all too tentative attempt to tune it up according to both the new historiographical views and the official plans to dismantle the welfare state, modernizing the country, and engage in a free trade zone with the United States. That was the context of 1992. The books in 1992, which were never applied because of the protests, in the books, mestizaje, miscegenation, was still part of the story told by the new textbook, but blended with update emphasis on diversity and multiculturalism. And 1848 was still considered along the controversial lines, the conventional lines of all textbook histories in Mexico. But the U.S. post-war economic growth and power appear as a great potential for Mexico's future. Rather than getting rid of the deep-rooted values which dated to the liberal 19th century and revolution, the new textbook attempted to sanitize the 1970 anti-colonial independentista third war accent that had characterized previous narratives. But these textbooks were far from a radical reconsideration. They just wanted to talk about the U.S. progress as an opportunity for Mexico. But vis-a-vis Indian debates in the 1990s, the Mexican debates could sound like a fight for an adjective here and there. Nevertheless, teachers rejected the textbook primarily because of the view of the United States. Progressive intellectuals and journalists dedicated a considerable number of articles to destroying the books. An intellectual in Mexico's progressive newspaper La Jornada epitomized many views. I quote, The authors of the textbooks, which were official intellectuals close to the government, rewrote the national history as if they were US citizens. They only did not write it in English, which would have been the right thing to do for their fixed erosion, their twisting of the fundamental historical facts. End of quote. Moreover, progressive US Mexicanists, in turn, had been producing over the 1990s views of alternative nationalisms and alternative indigenous Mexicos, and thus in 1992 or in 1994 with the Chiapas Rebellion, or today are still defending their own Mexico. The point here is not to validate one or another view of what really Mexico means. I merely wanted to show that the common response to textbooks in 1992 was not other thing than to save nacionalismo revolucionario by Mexicans and Americans. This, in sum, has been the Mexican way, so to speak, to address the above-mentioned enigmas of justice, oblivion, and inclusion. This Mexican way, as believed, is based on unquestionable beliefs in racial, ethnic, civilization, and cultural essentials, just as in India or in the United States. It's also based on the imperative to do justice through history, as in Spain or Germany, if not as dramatically. In brief, in the Mexican case, almost all the world's contested issues of other textbook controversy necessarily have to do with facing the challenge of lo gringo. That is, translating to Mexico such topics as provincializing Europe, the challenge of the popular, redefining the subaltern, justice through historical truth, taming nationalism, rescuing history from the nation. All these in Mexico are inevitably linked to the mutual construction between US and Mexico. Let me spell this out in the form of three final interconnected and opinionated contentions. First, the riddle of a deep, real, or alternative Mexico is not that of pre-Hispanic mythology or of an unchanging non-Western purity that is there just waiting to emerge after 5 centuries of radical transformation. To face the challenge of the popular a la Chakrabarty in writing history in Mexico is to face a spectrum that has been so bright that has blinded historians' eyes. Mexicans, for all their diversity, ethnic or social, do not form other civilization or ontology than that of ugly modern Christendom, fully agringado. Elites and subalterns in Mexico have been for very long economically, humanly, and culturally linked to lo gringo. The very attempt to define the purity and non-Western nature of the real Mexicans will be inseparable from almost a century of US and Mexican novels, commentaries, poems, ethnologies, archaeological diggings, and historical works. So the struggle to write a usable past for the people could be in the defeat of the civilizational barrier. But this truly touches the limits of our historical imagination. Second, since lo gringo in Mexican history and lo mexicano in the US history are showing us the limit of our historical imagination, I think that the past and future of the idea of a common European history is a necessary point of reference. Almost 4 decades of documenting a common history and cultural consciousness for Europe might, in the long run, turn out to be a political and social failure. Yet, the mere effort, and so far his consequences in terms of peace, political stability, and economic progress, makes the effort to create an idea of Europe more appealing intellectual temptation than keeping untouched the craft of the national historian. Why has the idea of a citizen-like process of integration not been even remotely considered for and in North America? Can North America become a symbol of a different kind of relationship in which cultural particularities are there, but in which a common past and a common future are assumed responsibly? Again, to the limits of our historical imagination. Finally, civilizational difference between Mexico and US histories are supported in lasting, though empirically weak, historical and cultural arguments. While the Spanish part of the equation was Easternized, the indigenous part was over-racialized, discriminated against, or idealized. What resulted were racial, civilization, and I would say even ontological oppositions. France, Spain, and Germany can still use the oldest nasty stereotypes about each other, and yet their differences are not as institutionalized as those between Mexico and the US. For exactly the same reason, it is assumed that one will not mix oil and water. Race, to be sure, is at the very core of this paradox. It is neither history, nor culture, nor wealth which has made of Mexico another radical different civilization. It is race. To this epochal truth, which make us, we the multi-culturalism, contemporaries to 200 years of nationalistic Manichaean racial thinking, very little can be added. So be it. Either viva la raza, or we start over again a new cycle of historical imagination. The developmental differences are more visible and discussable than race. These developmental differences, however, all too often become one with the paradox of Easternness, further reason to see Mexico as other. Those Latinos are just not part of the Protestant, individualistic, entrepreneurial, innovative, and modern ethos. Well, to finish, we can keep fighting shadows, but we in Mexico and in the United States have reached a human, ecological, cultural, and political point of no return. And this point of no return, to go back to Jose, my Pilsen student, constitutes indeed the all we Mexican Americans have left. Thank you very much.
I think we have a minute or two to stretch.
Okay.
And
I guess we can. We were supposed to finish at 5:30, but we can keep this room so we can go on a little later.
When reading Tom Bender's paper and Mauricio Trillo's abstract, unfortunately I didn't get this very interesting paper right on time when I left Germany. So when reading the paper and the abstract, I was thinking about links, overlaps, and recurring issues. In my view, there are at least 4 points, and they are very closely connected. First of all, the question of representation, of inclusion and exclusion. Second, history as means of shaping identity and strengthening patriotism. Third, the interrelationship between the state, the public, the political arena, and the historical profession regarding the production of historical knowledge. And fourth, textbooks as a product of and an issue for the marketplace. I'm going to touch upon all these points, but I will primarily focus on the question of representation and identity, which is, as Mauricio Trillo in his paper and the 2 papers in the morning have already made clear, a highly challenging one from a European point of view as well. And that's why I'm going to add some remarks from this European point of view. Both papers stressed the fact that school textbooks fulfill a central role in the construction of national, but also ethnic and religious identities, and also in conveying official historical conceptions. All over the world, textbooks are supposed to create cohesion and to produce political legitimation within particular societies. They are sometimes seismographs for the zeitgeist and may, in rare cases, even display new standards developed by academic historians. John Bender and Mauricio Trillo explained the obstacles historians face when trying to influence textbook contents and curriculum. So it seems altogether there can be no doubt about their rather more conservative character. So one question is, are school textbooks, are generally a delayed reconstruction of academic developments, and do they generally tend to replicate the societal consensus, and with that the myths, the stereotypes, and the patriotic images on which this consensus is often based? The significance attributed to the medium of school textbooks by all papers presented here is evidenced by several arguments. Not only by the important role they are set to play in the process of nation building or stabilizing increasingly heterogeneous nation states. Another one is the fact that attempts towards general political reconciliation often first took place at the level of joint cooperation regarding school textbooks. The German-French, the German-Polish, or the Israeli-Palestinian textbook discussion forums are just some examples. But of course, examples for this damage control approach Michael Geyer talked about in his introductory remarks. Textbooks significantly influence the cultural identity of the next generation in an important phase of life. They define relevant topics, establish patterns of interpretation, and offer valuation norms. Thus, textbooks influence concepts of the self and the other, of social, religious, or ethnic groups, and of course of what is supposed to be a nation across generations. Both papers made clear that textbooks often predetermine a consistent master narrative and neglect the need for alternative narratives. To be fair, textbook authors also do this for practical reasons. For example, to reduce complexity or to meet the student's assumed learning stage. But then again, it is precisely because of their comprehensive and highly selective nature that textbooks become instruments of state remembrance policy and key resources in projects of identity building through knowledge production, from the US and Mexico to Central Europe or India. This generally acknowledged function of the textbook is mostly employed by the nation state. Yet now, the European Union is setting new trends. While in one part of Europe, as Charles Ingrao made clear, textbooks legitimize new nation states and turn multi-ethnicity down. In the other part of Europe, the textbook is becoming a battleground for shaping a European, which means a transnational identity, and a battleground for presenting competing strategies of connecting national and European identities. Bearing the American and the Mexican experience in mind, which was analyzed in these two papers, this might be an interesting challenge, and therefore I would like to add some points from the European perspective. Interesting why? Following the collapse of the socialist states, Europe has become much more diverse, ambivalent, and colorful in many ways, including its historical dimension. This is food for thought for the European elites, who used to point out that Europe's strength lay in its cultural diversity. Nevertheless, they are now concerned about social cohesion within this diverse Europe, and especially within the European Union. They are therefore increasingly attempting to inspire a feeling of belonging, spanning the whole of Europe via the concept of common values. And it seems to be clear that history will play a key part in this. What basis this process would require and the role to be held by academic historians are both topics of fierce debate. The current highly controversial discussion regarding a European history textbook demonstrates the significance and conflict potential inherent in questions of a collective European identity, which should recognize shared roots and values as well as contribute to transnational and transcultural understanding amongst young Europeans. If we remember the obstacles Charles Ingrao spoke about regarding the new, strongly patriotic or nationalist textbooks in Central Europe, one has to ask why this project is so widely criticized. Shouldn't we be happy that our politicians want to use history not as a means of creating national identity, but to promote the breaking of historical boundaries and the development of international understanding? Referring also to other papers of this day and to Michael Geyer's introduction, let me point on some of the problems. First, in the debate, Europe and its history are mostly understood merely in terms of values and ideas coming from the current centers, resulting in Western dominance. And that means in such a master narrative, very little space would remain for the identities of the new states of the European Union or even the other European states. The images of Europe are often affirmative and teleological and created by the hegemonic centers. And incidentally, this is not only the case with textbooks, but sometimes also with academic historians. Second, in historical debates, Europe often appears not as a completely new project. The blueprint seems to be similar to the process of nation-state building in the 19th century. Europe's protagonists are also attempting to replace cultural heterogeneity with clarity in order to create a feeling of belonging amongst the population and in order to inspire an emotional connection to the project Europe. And they also often refer to the character of the other, either internally, for example, to Muslim minorities, or externally, for example, to Turkey or Russia. Almost all nation states, as the papers held here have emphasized, attempt to define their own identity in reference to others or the other. Images of the self and the other are subject to a mutual dependence and are thus still components of most school textbooks. Third point, the often cited simultaneity of the unsimultaneous makes it almost impossible to achieve a European history book. Why and to what extent? Reason European integration, and here I refer to Charles Ingrao paper 2, coincides with the late process of nation building in the former socialist states. Nearly all of these states felt the need to legitimize their own national existence and the role they wish to play within the European Union or Europe historically. Textbooks have played a crucial role in providing this legitimation, in creating new national identities, and often in line with this, in underlying their own Europeanness. Here we face an interesting phenomenon. the more those states and their citizens are interested in becoming a respected part of Europe, the more important their national pride and a history that gives reason for this pride becomes. Fourth, the new Europeans would like to see an expansion not only of the European Union but also of the historical awareness of the Europeans' direction east or southeast. They would like to see and feel that the old Europeans are interested in them, their history and their contribution that they have already made to Europe during the course of their history. If the Western Europeans, however, continue to show limited interest and limited sensitivity towards these states, then massive conflicts of identity and perception will arise. Not least because, fifth, Europe is confronted with particularly diverse collection of memories, and it must learn to deal with this, with these diverse memories. Here are former enemies, there are victims, here are perpetrators, and so on. They have to deal with the precarious and ambivalent aspects of a memory that is both shared and divided. If we consider how difficult it is in Mexico to root a wider American perspective in school textbooks, and if we look more closely at the debates in the United States on inclusion of Native Americans and their view of American history, we begin to suspect what this really means. In Europe, there are at least as many different views of European history as there are European states, without mentioning the fact that national identities are never closed and that every culture experiences diversity in itself. Here are only 3 examples for the plurality of such interpretations. First, everywhere in the world, the new German-French history book is attracting a great amount of attention. For Koreans, Chinese, and the Japanese, for example, it was a sensation that former arch enemies could achieve such cooperation and succeed in having the book implemented in both countries. Our Polish neighbors were, however, horrified, for they felt ignored. If there are no details of the long processes of confrontation around the German-Polish border in this book, yet a large photograph showing Chirac, Schröder, and Putin standing together in post-unity, then many Poles see the danger of a new Heilige Allianz, Holy Alliance. A second example, I just skip one and give a second example, is the different view of the First World War, which in Eastern Europe is not seen as the disaster of the 20th century. It is also not primarily associated with the collapse of a European order of peace, which in itself was always seen as a hegemonic domination. In their views, the consequences of First World War I at least laid the foundation for nation building, and on this fundament for a return to Europe via liberation from the foreign rule on the part of the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Ottomans. Sixth problem. It is problematic that almost all textbooks, and this does not only go for Europe, feature a strong tendency toward homogeneity. This also concerns the European history book already available, which was published in 1992 and has been translated into 15 languages. The book may be a noteworthy attempt to denationalize European history books. Its problematic nature can, however, hardly be overlooked. Both the selection of events defined as relevant and the structure of the narrative are dominated by teleological concepts of progress. The focus is on the emphasis of a shared inheritance, which is to a great extent juxtaposed with Latin Christianity and the Enlightenment. For students from peripheral regions, it does not offer much to identify with or to be proud of, because Central and Eastern Europe are nearly ignored. Historical narratives, however, can only be socially effective if they are the result of inclusive processes of the negotiation on the one hand, and on the other hand, if they refer to the real experiences and memories of those whom they wish to integrate. Textbooks that consciously portray the complexity of the world and admit to differing and often competing historical narratives are, however, a rarity all over the world. Generally, the textbook authors are themselves not even aware of how different the same historical events can be evaluated. At the moment, it is still extremely rare for textbooks to present, for example, the European continent as a space of communication, as a space of interaction with, depending on the question and the subject, flexible boundaries and varying points of conflict. And the same seems to be true of the American continent, if I have understood Tom Bender and Mauricio Trillo correctly. Even rarer, however, is an openness to plurality of historical narratives, which could cast a critical constructive light onto the self-image and actions of one's own nation, giving students the chance to learn historical thought and deconstruct deadlocked interpretations. Textbook authors and publishers should more often be courageous in juxtaposing different interpretations so that they can be compared by the students and examined for commonalities, yet primarily for the causes of difference. I do not believe that formulating compromises can or should be a primary task when working on textbooks, as was the case with the German, French textbooks and all traditional textbook commissions. What we want are students who can think for themselves, future citizens with the potential to be critical, who can deal with pluralism and deconstruct, who can move independently within an historical context. Whether or not textbook authors and publishers will ever acknowledge the ambivalence of our world and our history, and whether they will ever see plural interpretations as a positive thing, at the moment this is difficult to say. Not least because of the fact Thomas Bender stressed. In most countries of the world, textbooks are a market phenomenon as well as a matter of the state. Of course, the situation in democratic and authoritarian states are different. Interestingly enough, the consequences are ambivalent, as Charles Ingrao made clear in his paper. Just one more example. Our Arab partners working with us in the project on images of Europe in Arabic textbooks ensured us that their textbooks would include much more stereotypes and prejudices regarding the West, when the public opinion would have a direct influence on the making of textbooks. At present, it seems to be the authoritarian state that ensures a fair approach. But in democratic societies as well, textbook publishers are dependent on the approval of the government. If they want to sell their books, they cannot write and print what several authors wish to tell the students, but what goes along with the official curricula. And on the other hand, textbook publishers work, as Tom Bender made clear, in a market that is much bigger and much more attractive than the academic book market is. This market is, at least in democratic states, highly competitive. In Hungary, for example, there are meanwhile 90 textbook publishers active in the field. And since the interest of the small group of academic historians is not necessarily congruent with the preferences and the interests of the main group of consumers, which is students, their parents, and the teachers, there is always some kind of gap between the recent standards of historical research and of historical school textbooks. The most interesting question in this context might be at which point and under which circumstances publishers just have no other choice than to adhere to the recommendations of textbook commissions and the standards of the historical profession. Or to say it in other words, when do they have to minimize the gap between the historical knowledge of the public and the achievements of the historical scholarship Tom Bender focused on? When talking about consumerism, the market, and selling products, let me finally come back to the question regarding the way in which we might, at the moment, be able to represent different memories of different groups within a larger society. And let me give you some ideas about a project we are currently developing at our institute. In this project, we will analyze images of Europe to be found in history and geography textbooks of the last 100 years. The project will investigate historical and current changes in our understanding of centers and peripheries, how different regions relate and have related to Europe, and how they define their own Europeanness out of friction with supposedly non-European others, such as Russia, North Africa, or Turkey. We do not primarily refer to the well-known Western images of Europe and its history, but focus on those images that new European Union states or applicant states convey and have conveyed to countless young people. That approach works on the hypothesis that European cohesion is defined mainly at or from its borders, real or imaginary. Considering the peripheries thus serves as a corrective for the often affirmative and teleological images that are created by the hegemonic centers. The concept of the periphery is, of course, to be understood here in its meaning as a synonym for geographical outskirts. It should not be misinterpreted as an attribute regarding power distinctions. With the project, we will provide material conditions to begin an open and inclusive process of exchange on the subject of what is meant by Europe. Indeed, it will fill gaps in our knowledge that are not seldom occasions of misunderstandings and distrust when dealing with difficult issues. If we give different narratives meaning and representation, what is intended via an open internet access platform and translation, we might not only stimulate academic discussion and critical thinking amongst scholars, but maybe also stimulate textbook authors in all European and maybe even non-European regions. Europe, to sum up, has not only to solve a very difficult task, but it also has a privilege. It must learn to deal with multiple histories and multiple modernities in multi- or polyethnic contexts. If different and competing positions find their way into the discourse on our schools, then this could lead to the insight that history is always a matter of interpretation and construction, that a shared orientation can only be found via openness for the interpretation of immediate or more distant neighbors. The goal would be to create a community of science and communication capable of understanding opposing ideas. This goal is surely not to be realized today or tomorrow. Anybody dealing with textbooks, and this is, I think, what all papers here remind us, must be both patient and brave. Courage is needed when we try to view our national history or the histories of Europe or of America, not only as a success story, but also as a space of historical conflict and opposing memory cultures. Differences must be made visible. They must be declared and explained, not harmonized. Periphery centers and non-European perspectives must be rendered visible in their transnational and trans-regional connections, structures of communication, related histories, and integration processes. Learning each other's narrative in order to develop the critical thinking Tom Bender spoke about might be a fruitful first step for reaching this goal, not only for Europeans, but for other regions and societies as well.